Joining us now, much to our honor, is Sasha Toperich. Now, Sasha is a senior executive vice president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. That is a think tank. It's a newly formed think tank in Washington, D.C. Sasha is an FOJ, friend of John. He was born in Sarajevo. He lived in Israel for 2 decades before moving to the United States 20 years ago. Now, Dr. Toperich is a non-resident fellow at the Sorin University Research Center in Iraqi Kurdistan, and he's chairman of the supervisory board at the Mediterranean Development Initiative, MDI, in Tunis, Tunisia. Now, I could go on and on and on with his credentials, but let me just say that Sasha is one of the foremost experts on the Middle East and what is going on right now. We just had a chance to meet Corey Lewandowski. I have to give you guys an intro while I'm live on the air, Sasha, but good to have you with us. Thanks for being with us today. I could go on and on about your credentials, but thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, John.
So let's start with some of the things that we've been talking about all week. That's why I asked you to come in. And start with the breaking news that Qatar is leaving OPEC. OPEC now in somewhat of a chaotic state. The Saudis have enormous pressure on them by President Trump to keep production up, to keep prices down. Some of their members aren't happy with that. But Qatar basically saying, I'm done with the whole thing. What are your thoughts on that, Sasha?
Well, I think that was a very smart decision Qatar took. Qatar announced it wants to focus on increasing liquefied gas production. They will also increase oil production from 4.8 to 6.5 million barrels a day, although Qatar is only world's 11th oil producer, amounting to less than 2% of global output. I think the U.S. will both understand and welcome Qatar's decision that plays well into President Trump's justified harsh rhetoric on OPEC cartel. It's also important that there is a bipartisan support in the Congress on this issue, with the ongoing discussions how to curb OPEC's manipulative control over the oil market prices. The U.S. Department of Justice, as you know, is reviewing the antitrust laws, and that is certainly a step in this direction. What comes next? I think we should be very seriously and carefully looking into this, how to create a free oil market, what would mean if the OPEC will be reformed, and there are huge open questions remain to be answered. However, Qatar will be the first country actually to leave OPEC since it was founded in 1960. I think first and foremost this is a geostrategic and political decision, and I think right one that coming from Qatar.
So Qatar pulls out, the first OPEC member ever that's pulled out. Now, detail us, obviously Qatar's not happy with the Saudi regime since Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has taken over. They've had to endure an embargo, which is pretty much blown up in MBS's face. So as far as Qatar is concerned, like Saudis and them have been a problem. So they're pulling out of OPEC, but they only represent, like you said, 2% of oil production there. So is it that big of a deal?
Well, I think it's perhaps primarily and not only decision made to respond to imposed blockade, but to make a stand against OPEC oil price manipulation that are often of a political nature.
Right.
Increasing oil prices has become sort of a political, and if you, John, want to call it a blackmail weapon used by various political reasons, and so was and is the imposed blockade of Qatar that frankly failed and left deep scars in the region that not are only on political level, but people to people, as many families were forced to be separated, either to leave Qatar or if from GCC countries to go back to Qatar. Those who were married between Bahrainis or Saudis and Qataris, the families often had to be split. Students who were studying either in Emirates or Saudis didn't know whether they will continue studying there, or students from these countries, whether they will stay in Qatar. Although Qatar was very graceful and did not request, like the other GCC countries, to expel GCC other nationals from Qatar. U.S. administration, I think, is very right to seek the diplomatic solution to GCC rift in an effort to keep the eyeball on fighting extremist ISIS and terrorism. Look, blockade has much to do with a numerous internal dynamics, and I think was meant to simplify and to punish Qatar for not falling in, so to say, on ways the autocracies in the region, and especially in Saudi Arabia and Emirates, would like to see fit.
So the Saudi, when Mohammed bin Salman put together the blockade, or when you're in Qatar, they call it the siege, which I think is interesting. It's almost kind of reminded me when I went there, when I first came to the South, when I grew up in New Jersey, New York area. It was the Civil War. My first venture to the South was South Georgia in Augusta, and everybody called it the War of Northern Aggression. So it was just, they called it something else. When you go to Qatar, they call it the siege, and we call it the embargo or the blockade. But when Mohammed bin Salman put that together with Egypt, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, they had a number of demands, which none were met, and they thought that it would basically either cause a change in Qatari leadership, maybe a coup where the emir of the family got overthrown, someone else gets in, or there would be uprising because of the blockade. So, but it failed, because when I went there, the people in Qatar, the people on the street were telling me that short-term pain, long-term gain, that when everything was said and done, the economy was better off, GDP was up, and they had better choices and lower prices. And outside of the humanitarian issue, the whole purpose of the blockade blew up in MBS's face. Why doesn't he just admit that and end it?
Well, that's a good question. Let me first go to good news. Just yesterday, the Emir of Qatar was invited to a 39th Supreme Council to take place on December 9, the GCC Council. So let's see how that will play itself out. I'm not that optimistic that the blockade will end and anytime soon, and not only because of any practical reason, but it's a question of prestige. Who will blink first? I think it's one of those, in that region, dynamics that sometimes we fail to understand fully or to comprehend. But it's very important, and it sort of goes as a pyramid from the top to bottom. If you show weakness, if you blink first, if you make a concession first. I think continuous calls, very gentle and very strong by the Trump administration to close this rift, to bring the people seeking diplomatic solutions to whatever pending internal regional issues they have, is the right approach. And I think the president was very right.
You're right. So the ending of the blockade or the reconciliation of the GCC really has got to be brokered by the Trump administration. Remember, they had a potential peace meeting at Camp David, remember?
Right.
And they canceled it. The president and his allies there in the White House, supporters, canceled it because they really couldn't find an upside to it, and they were afraid they were going to fail. Their sides were too far apart, so they just canceled it. But you think that long term, that's going to be the answer, right?
Possibly. Look, Qatar has proved that the blockade doesn't work. They reached out to Southeast Asia. They boost their partnership with India, with Pakistan. They reached out to their Western allies. They developed their own agricultural production very fast. They've actually discovered that they are, because of their financial wealth, that they are more organized and more strong to cope with the blockade and to cope with the blockade successfully. So I think actually, in a one way, Qatar benefited from the blockade. It's difficult, it's painful. I think they are very rational about trying to amend the crisis that benefits actually only extreme elements in a region and then puts the entire world in fact in a danger. But they prove themselves and the world they're self-sustainable, and that they do not need GCC per se as an entity. Now, President Trump call to create sort of Arab NATO is a good call. It's a question how that will work. I think it's a very right from our perspective to seek for more regional alliances, and that one also with the GCC. We'll see, John. We don't have a magic bullets to answer all the questions, but I think what you mentioned with the killing of Khashoggi, as important as strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is and should be, it has put profound stain on Saudis, and has sort of shifted discussions, both within the U.S. Congress, the administration, but the entire international community, over how to proceed the GCC crisis as well. And I think the president is maneuvering this very difficult situation he found his administration in especially that Saudi Arabia is a key to his Middle East Israel-Palestinian masterpiece plan, or as he called the deal of a century, how that will now fall into a place, what if there will be any consequences, not so positive of Saudi's credibility to be a very important part of an Israel-Palestinian deal. We still have a way to see. I do support Senator Lindsey Graham and people in the Congress, and we should stand to our values. We should stand internationally to the values.
Right.
We cannot accept journalists being murdered in any way, form, of shape, and the brutality of that killing is mind-boggling. It really makes a person speechless. However, criticism from a Congress and actions that are floating in the discussions there are right. So is the president. President needs to protect the U.S. national interest. We have a long-term, a strategic and long-standing great relationship with Saudi Arabia. So it has President Obama, President Bush. It goes way back. And and not only deals $1 billion of businesses that we have, but it is regional issues that we're trying to curb the Iran nuclear program, and we need an allies such as Saudi Arabia. However, I think the relationship will reshape itself in some way and form. And I think actually at the end of the day may end up being very healthy. Just have to wait and see.
There's no question that the president is trying to make his decision based on what he feels is in the long-term best interest of the United States and Americans, and not being knee-jerk to a particular event. We're with Dr. Sasha Toperich. We're live in Washington, D.C. Dr. Toperich is the senior executive vice president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. This is a newly formed think tank in Washington, D.C. For the last 5 years, he was a senior fellow and director of the Mediterranean Basin, Middle East, and Gulf Initiative at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Paul H. Nitsky School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. So he's very well versed. The Qatar decision to pull out of OPEC, I really find that fascinating. I just want to get back to that. And was their decision primarily, do you think, geopolitical? Do you think they wanted to put their finger in the eye of the Saudis over the blockade?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it is primarily geopolitical, and I think it's actually a bold statement, a courageous bold statement to address long-standing problems that OPEC is facing. Look, earlier in the day, Venezuela is one of the founding members of OPEC, wanted to pull out. Other countries from OPEC wanted to pull out. It's a very complex business. It's a very complex group, as I said, very often guided by the political regional interests, whether you decrease the oil prices, hence reduce the revenue to Iraq, to Algeria, and the many countries that are completely dependent on oil prices with the welfare of their citizens. So those are decisions roughly very manipulative. So how to change them? I think what Qatar gave to the world, and a positive, I think, silver plate also to the administration, is indirectly supporting President Trump, very justified harsh criticism over OPEC, and his really justified request to decrease oil prices for the benefit not only on the American consumers when we go to the gas station to tank our cars, but in general for the entire world. Now, it's more complicated because we have a blockade, we have sanctions against Iran, we have a very unstable Venezuela, we have problems and with Iraq still. We have Libya not stabilized, and we can talk, I guess, about Libya later. And those countries that need to come up with a continued flawless output of oil to subsidize for lack of Iranian export. I think all of this will play into a decision what will be the next steps. But I think Qatar said, okay, let's open it up in front, and let's try to solve this within the OPEC. We will pull out. We will focus on our increased natural gas. Right. We will increase oil production, as I said, from 4.8, I think, to 6.5 million barrel. It is insignificant in respect to the global output. However, it gave politically a momentum that people internationally will be discussing what is the future of OPEC, and it will, I think, put a pressure on OPEC to restructure, reform, if nothing else, the way they conduct business. And that's exactly what President Trump and the administration wanted. And what I'm very happy about, that's also what the Congress wants, and that's what the bipartisan Congress wants. So I think it's we have to recognize this is the moment in a foreign policy where both sides came together. I think it's excellent.
Well, I think you're right, and one of the benefits of Qatar pulling out of OPEC is that they can increase their oil production and do with it as they please. They're not tied to, as you said earlier, I think you called it the OPEC price manipulation that is driven by politics and not necessarily economics, and that's been that way for some time. As it is right now, Saudis have increased their production to lower oil prices to placate President Trump, because they really need him to not cut them off right now. So I want to get to some other topics here. Are we in agreement? Let's close out on Trump and MBS and Saudi Arabia. Are we in agreement that the president is making the right decision in preserving the long-term strategic partnership between the United States and KSA, even as a result or even in response to the fact that it's pretty obvious that MBS was directing Khashoggi's murder?
We are. I think we are. And look, I think any president would put first our national interest in scope when making a decision. And plus, look, John, this is going to be an ongoing process. We don't know how this will all unfold. As we talked earlier, it's connected to our peace plan between Israel and Palestinians. It's connected to various issues that are strategically important for the United States. It is highly connected to our sanctions, reimposed sanctions on Iran. So there are a lot of segments that the president has to consider that are really important long term. And as I said, likewise, it's also very good that the Congress is taking firm stand on MBS over the brutal, despicable killing over the journalist Khashoggi. And I think what is already achieved, that there has been huge stain over Saudi Arabia conducting business as it is. So I think that in itself, I think we should say, will already be enough to reshape the Saudis' conduct, I guess, in Yemen and elsewhere, and perhaps with the rest of the world, starting with the United States.
Well, you just take a simple thing like, remember when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came to the U.S., was that 6 months ago, and met with the president in the Oval Office, went to the White House, and then did his charm offensive and went to Silicon Valley, went to Texas, met with CEOs and oil companies. I mean, nobody would get within 1,000 feet of this guy. Nobody's going to want to. There's no U.S. CEO that is going to touch him, meet with him, have a conversation with him, lest they be ostracized by consumers. The president wouldn't even shake his hand at the G20 summit. So he's kind of ostracized himself, and he's kind of become a pariah. So, when they talk about sanctions against him, he's already sanctioned just in the court of public opinion, right?
Correct.
He's done.
Well, I don't know what to say on word done, but that there is a verdict on what you say public court of opinion. Yes, there has been. It has been done, and it's going. It's impressive how the world is keeping, rightly so, momentum over this case. And I think that's right. But look, reforms in Saudi Arabia are important.
Right.
That women can finally drive car is for that country step in a very right direction. And look, we at the United States are example. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've lived in various countries, as you point out. I traveled the world extensively, and we are really the beacon of the light of democracy. We are a free society. We have values that we stand upon, and the world look up to these values. And surely we still have a long way to in a partnership and coherent partnership with all GCC countries, if we already talk about that region, to influence that these countries and citizens in that region of the world can live to the standards that we live, have the same rights, have the same freedom, have the same access to education, primarily important so that there are no people who will turn into extremism and religious extremism of the Islamic terrorism, as unfortunately has been the case. So there is a lot at stake here, and I think President has to wage very carefully, not to destroy or to say at least damage relationship that would be beyond repair or that would have a more profound consequences on overall issues that we just talked and others that we didn't.
We're with Dr. Sasha Toperich here live in Washington, D.C. on the John Frederick Show. He's Senior Executive Vice President of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Dr. Toperich, let's move to Libya. It's kind of gotten off everybody's radar screen since the disaster that the Obama administration pursued there. Libya also has issues with oil production due to the very volatile political situation. What's going on in Libya, and were the recent Palermo talks successful, in your judgment?
Well, Palermo talks were successful and mostly not successful. Success was limited to agreement on a Libyan national conference to take place early in January next year, 2019. The U.S. has sent the acting assistant secretary for the Near Eastern Affairs, Ambassador David Satterfield, while Russia sent the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. The EU came on a high level, bringing High Representative for Foreign Affairs Mogherini and Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council. Germany and France sent their foreign ministers. Now, this is an interesting point. The host, Italy, excluded from this mini summit Turkey and Qatar, as Italy does seek a contract for a construction of a 267 kilometers long pipeline to transport oil from the oil field of Port of Sidra. The value of the project is around $1 billion.
The oil going from Libya to Italy.
Yeah, well, it's a pipeline that is under the control of General Haftar, who is a leader of so-called National Army, who is de facto in charge of a Tobruk-based House of Representatives that is at odds with a government at Tripoli. Look, Libya needs a new constitution, Libya needs new elections, and needs a serious economic reforms and reconciliation program. Now, we need to help stabilize the country, to also stabilize the oil outputs, eliminate migration of Libyans, and also transit routes through Libya from other African countries trying to reach our allies in Europe, and potentially, with some of them, having intentions to create chaos and terrorist attacks in Europe. We need to help these people bridge their divides. And just as an example, I'll tell you, I was in Tripoli this summer, just before the fighting erupted in August. And I met, among other politicians, Khalid Meshri is the president of High Council of Libya. He represents Muslim Brotherhood. He reached out unconditionally to the Tobruk people at the east, and to hope in starting healing process and to start the negotiations to unblock current long-standing gridlock. Looking from the internal political dynamics in Libya, where it is very highly unpopular that you reach to another's. That's a mentality. It's
you don't
similar.
Reach out to others.
You don't reach out to others, and that's why these negotiations for constitutions take 4 and 5 almost years.
Right.
But Meshri's attitude represents a progressive attitude. So I think, look, we have two main reasons to pay attention on Libya. One is to stabilize the oil production, especially now that Qatar will highlight the problems, reinforce the president's and congressional worries over OPEC conduct of oil market business. But in a sanctions we imposed on Iraq, having stable output of oil from Libya is very important for the global economy.
Right.
And second, it's important that we strongly engage with Libya in counter-terrorism activities. There are some successes, small, limited successes made. And look, we don't have an eyes in Libya that much. We don't have an embassy after killing of our ambassador, Stevenson. There was our embassy moved to operates from Tunisia.
This was after the Benghazi.
And I think the U.S. I don't think it's a bad policy, but we've conduct mostly our diplomatic business through the United Nations program, and we have a deputy to UN Envoy, Special Envoy Gassame. We have a deputy, Stephanie Williams, who is, I think, doing a terrific job advocating the U.S. Policies, and actually it's a consensus, international politics, on how to stabilize Libya. And there are rifts. Look, there are interests. Italian and French are battling themselves.
Well, the Italians have their own agenda, right?
Yeah.
Because you have this summit in Palermo, and basically the Italians, the new right-wing government of Italy, they have one objective, and that's to get the pipeline done so they can get the energy.
And it's not just on a pipeline, John. The Eni is longly present in Libya. They have vast interests. So does French Total. There is Libya
That's
is
the French energy company.
Exactly. So look, Libya
number
is
one energy company in France.
Very rich in oil reserves. I think mostly
Total.
all of this fighting is about the future of Libya, who will control NOC, the National Oil Corporation, and how the spurs of funding will go. I think it was in a way, and I hate comparisons, in a way similar problem we faced after fall of Saddam in Iraq. There was much more complicated because there was also ethnic retribution over Sunnis by Shias.
So you had basically the same thing in Tripoli. You have a power vacuum.
Yes, but it's also more complicated because that's a tribal society. There are tribes in Libya who Gaddafi punished earlier, so then it's difficult for them to reconcile. There are efforts. There's a power vacuum, as you rightly said. I'll tell you, I talked to the Vice President Kajman when I was in Tripoli. Yes, and he said, look, I wanted to make a reconciliation between Teba and Toperich tribes in south, and I managed, and they wanted reparations that actually doesn't amount to much, maybe $70-80 million, so that the families could be satisfied, and they reached agreement, signed a peace, but the money never came from the government, and we could maybe speculate here as to why, but he told me very directly, first-hand information. Well, Sarraj, the head of Presidential Council, and General Haftar did not agree. Haftar didn't like South to be stabilized because he wanted to recruit more folks from South to his army. And Sarraj knows he needs to have some good relationship with Haftar so that he wouldn't steer the water because he does control Tobruk. And it's really complicated. But at the end of the day, the peace agreement, the reconciliation agreement in South fall apart
because
just
they never
because
got
of the
money.
politics.
Yeah,
because they never got the money.
They never got the money. Which brings us to Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I know as part of your think tank, you're trying to put this together. But what's the future, Dr. Toperich, Sasha Toperich, of the Muslim Brotherhood right now? Since they've been kicked out of Egypt. And one thing you told me at dinner last night, it's just kind of a question with a caveat. You told me at dinner that you go to different countries and the cab drivers tell you everything that's going on, right? And you told me that when you went to Cairo in Egypt, basically the cab drivers didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood because tourism was down. They weren't making any money. They were pissed off at the whole thing. And they wanted the Sisi coup, basically. So how does that all tie in? Yeah,
you're right on it. Thanks for mentioning it. I think really, apart from the politicians and people that you meet and conferences you attend, and I found two things. Talk to the taxi drivers. They will give you the pulse, the heart of the country. Mm-hmm. And go to the supermarkets and figure out how the food is structured, what is more highlighted, what people buy. See what's the financial power. You can see the DNA of a culture, and of course bake a bread with locals of every walk of life. Because I think that sort of gives you more picture. Look, I support President Sisi and I support President Trump. I wrote articles from Huffington Post when President Sisi came to Oval Office first time after President Trump took office, and I said that's a historic meeting between Egyptian and American president. Why did I say so? You will hear coming from our friends in a Democratic Party and the liberals that, Sisi is a dictator, he's abusing human rights. And look, he himself said, yes, we have an issues with the human rights. But I look to Egypt and any country in the world in a context that the country has found itself. Now, when Morsi took the power legitimately after the Arab Spring, he wanted to upgrade the constitution to create it more Islamic. He wanted to upgrade himself above the law for a certain amount of period, so that constitution passed that he cannot be revoked as a president. There has been a campaign over what the women can wear, and they were supposed and hinted by some people that they have to wear more traditional clothes. As you remember, John, that was a time where there has been serious rifts and between Christians and Muslims in Egypt. So when I talk to the most of Egyptians, the Muslim Brotherhood that was actually founded in Egypt in the 1920s, I would support the president's ban on the organization there. However, and I would support President Sisi, who took an office, engaged in a serious, comprehensive economic reforms. And, we always easily criticize, and we often have a problem praising. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you also, it's easy to talk about the reforms. And you have a number of smart people say, oh, yes, economic reforms are important. But when you take a country over 100 million and you embraced IMF, 12 billion, 3-year term loan, and you win 3 times appraisal and praises from the IMF on how the reforms are going, you stop fluctuation of your currency, you create more incentives to the investment laws, you change the religious laws, you promote the moderate Islam, you have set of agricultural reforms, energy sector reforms. Look, with the Zohar founding, offshore gas foundings in Egypt, Egypt has really a chance to stabilize itself. It's too much for a one mandate of a president who had to fight terrorists. We have to remember how many Christians were killed in terrorist attacks in Egypt. I talked to the Pope, Toperich II. I went to see all those sites with the bullets.
At Sisi's tenure now, and it's one success after the other economically. And I think that's why when you talk to cab drivers, they got more money in their pocket. People are going back to Egypt. And he stabilized the economy, which under the Muslim Brotherhood leader had turned into a complete shambles.
And look, yeah, you're right. And at the end of the day, look, the stability has improved. Tourism is back in Egypt. People feel more confident. There's hundreds of people killed, Muslims, as well in Egypt in terrorist attacks. Egypt has a big problem with an open border with Libya, where a number of these terrorist guys infiltrate, and the government, one can argue, can be more harsh, or is harsh actually, on a crackdown. However, this is all semantics. We don't have, thanks Lord, experiences that we have such a serious problems of car exploding in the streets and people just walking into we have our set of problems to that end as well. But this is a really, really rooted in Egypt. And so, Sisi himself said, we have to improve our human rights records and we have to call them accountable as the time goes. But you can't improve this if you don't have a stable economy. Mm-hmm. Sisi has made a campaign through his government, which is not binding, but it does echo in Egyptian society. The main problem of Egypt is natality. They have daily about 5,000 newly born kids. A year and ago, when I wrote an article, one of the articles on Egypt, the country was 91, 92 million. Nowadays, when you write about Egypt, you have to say country of an over $100 million. There is no amount of economic reforms that the country can take, no amount of FDIs, no amount of gas findings in such a vast country that can subsidize for such a huge natality. So there is a campaign called 2 is Enough that the government is promoting, educating people. It has
2
a
is
support
enough, so they want
to have to populations
control.
Exactly, because that's
population control.
And look, the minute you have more prosperous society, that they elevated recently. One other things to congratulate Egyptians, they elevated their extreme poverty by the World Bank report. What extreme poverty in Egypt means, those who really have no means to support themselves and those who could easily be turned into troublemakers and terrorists, because if they would be approached by the bad guys who offer them food on the table for them and their families,
they take it.
They take it. So we need to support economic reform. We need to support, and let me tell you, I've applauded the great work the United States Chamber of Commerce is doing in Egypt. There is a huge, vast business interest that the United States companies have, and multinational companies in Egypt. Egypt has a free trade agreements with the rest of Africa, so Egypt is a natural gateway for U.S. companies, also for the Middle East and African continent. So that there are issues with Egypt, there are, but that there are more positives today, and I supported the administration of recognizing those. I think it's right. Now, talking on a Muslim Brotherhood in general, you can't ban an international organization. Let me tell you why. First of all, we shouldn't take that they act same in Egypt and, for example, in Tunisia. Sheikh Ghanoush, head of Ennahda political party of Tunisia, 2 years ago, I believe, made a historic speech distancing his political party and movement from political Islam, embracing fully democracy. And he, as a member of a Muslim Brotherhood, immersed his party into the very profound and successful democratic processes we are seeing in that country. And so we can't say, hey, let's ban the entire organization. That would then include also Turkey, which we have to talk about later, because President Erdogan, with all the problems we have with Turkey today, is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood.
We have to get you back next week, because I want to talk about the Turkish situation. I also want to ask the question, one of the things that the Qatari government, the Emir, have been accused of is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. I want to get your take on that for next week when we get back together. And also, I want to talk about the general theme of what the U.S. involvement should be going forward. But we're out of time for this segment. Dr. Sasha Toperich, thank you for being with us, Senior Executive Vice President of the Transatlantic Leadership